welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about how I got into law school and also providing a comprehensive overview of what that process will look like if you're thinking about applying to law school as well. In this video, I'll be talking about all of the components of the application, basically. So that will cover everything from managing your timeline to taking the LSAT, asking for recommendation letters, and writing your personal statement and addenda. So if you haven't subscribed to my channel yet, please do so now and enjoy the video. Thanks, guys. Applying for law school. The first step is to figure out if you even want to go to law school. Now, I know a lot of people apply to law school because they think this is going to be a secure career, I don't really care what I do, I'm just gonna go into it because I heard that it's really easy to get a pretty high-paying job. And if that's your motivation, then, I mean, I guess. But to me, it seems like you should be doing something that, you think you'll be happy in. Now, for me personally, it was a bit of a multi-step process. Basically, I had been getting a master's in English literature. And I was, doing pretty well in my program, honestly, getting a lot out of it, but there was something about the nature of the work that just wasn't totally satisfactory to me. And I think that was something like engaging with the lived experience of the sort of literature I was studying, which was Asian American literatures of the 20th and 21st century. So law seemed like a good way to sort of combine the skills that I had built up in that program with a direct engagement with the structures of power that sort of undergird everything. So the second thing you want to do is plan out a general timeline for yourself. Now, applying to law school is a fairly long process, and you should be giving yourself plenty of time to sort of map out all of the steps you'll need to take. I started preparing for all of the process in December of 2015, and I'm going to be starting law school in, let's say, late August of 2017. So that is a pretty long time. Now, not everybody is going to need that much time. I was fortunate to be taking a couple of gap years after my master's degree in English literature, and those gap years really helped me sort of space things out and be really deliberate with the process. But again, I wouldn't recommend rushing into this because it is a huge decision. So in terms of what I actually did for this process, that December 2015 start date is when I started preparing for the LSAT. And obviously August 2017 is when I'm going to actually start my first quarter of law school, probably at Stanford. Okay, so let's move on to the first element of your law school application, which is the LSAT. I mean, obviously there are other components that I'm not really going to touch on because they're pretty self-explanatory, and those being, your GPA, which is pretty set, and your resume, which you should already have a good iteration of from, the end of college or whatever first job you took. But taking the LSAT, it is something that's a bit of a different beast from, the SAT, the ACT, or even the GRE, which a lot of us must be familiar with. It is a standardized test, but it does test a very specific mode of thinking. So it is something that I would highly recommend studying for. I mean, it doesn't matter how brilliant you are, the setups for the logic games are going to be pretty specific. So the LSAT is offered 4 times a year, and those times are in June, September, or October. I mean, this year it's September, but some years it's October, December, and February. Now, I took it twice, so the February and the June exams, but if you have sort of a broad timeline ahead of you and a lot of time to plan, I would recommend aiming for the June test for a couple of reasons. I mean, the February test is a non-disclosed test. So basically what this means is that after you take the test and you receive your score, typically about 3 weeks later, you're not going to be able to see an actual breakdown of the questions you missed. And if you're someone who's planning to retake the test, which you might want to depending on your circumstances, that means that taking the February exam first is going to be a little bit less helpful for you. The June test is well placed on the calendar as, a test that you might want to take because law school applications are due on a rolling basis in the fall. And that varies from school to school, but I wouldn't go according to their official deadline, because if you submit something by their official deadline, most of the seats at that school will already be full. So for me, taking the June test was, a good idea also because it's offered in the afternoon. So it's the only test that's offered from, I think it's roughly from 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. and all these other 3 dates are roughly from 8 a.m. to 1 p.m. So taking an 8 a.m. test is kind of rough if you're not a morning person, which I'm definitely not. And that meant that, I had to drive about an hour away to my testing center, which meant I got up at like 5:30 roughly and was just feeling a little bit sluggish. The other thing about the June and September tests is that they're the most popular test administrations, and you should be signing up well in advance. So I would say sign up as soon as the registration opens. That's like 2 to 3 months in advance. And for example, right now we're gearing up for the June test, right? And the registration deadline is, I believe, April 26th. We're still over a month away from that, but in major areas like New York, all the test centers are already full. So even though that deadline for registering for the LSAT is there, it's also not an accurate guideline for when you need to be registering. And to sign up for the LSAT, you just go to lsac.org and create an account. This is also going to be the portal that you use to submit all other aspects of your law school applications. So in terms of preparing for the LSAT, it is something that you have to take pretty seriously. I mean, the LSAT is a huge component of your law school application for a couple of reasons. I mean, everyone who applies to law school comes from a pretty different background because there's no specific track that precedes it necessarily. I mean, some schools do have a pre-law sort of major, but that's not necessary to apply. So you'll have, students who used to be pre-med or worked in finance or were English majors. So the LSAT is ostensibly a way to sort of accurately measure these students against each other. Now, whether that's fair or not, that's an issue that's sort of relevant to the entire standardized testing industry, but it is something that you have to contend with. Now, I was lucky to have a couple of friends who, had already gone through the law school application process by the time that I was preparing for mine. So they gave me some great advice, and one of my friends especially emphasized the importance of taking a lot of practice tests. But you want to do it in a measured and deliberate way, right? You don't want to just blow through the practice test because there are a limited number of tests available. She recommended about 30 tests in preparation for the actual exam, and I would have to say that was an effective method for me. I self-studied using a combination of 7-Sage videos, a Kaplan book, which honestly I don't really recommend, and a lot of the official tests put out by the LSAC themselves. Those books are available on Amazon or at Barnes & Noble, and they're called like Super Prep or the 10 Actual series, and that doesn't give you a lot of strategy or guidance, it's just the actual material. So the LSAT is broken down into 3 categories: reading comprehension, logical reasoning, and logic games. Now, reading comprehension is pretty straightforward. When I started preparing, I was like, I'm an English major, I read and comprehend things all the time, and it is pretty similar to the passages that you'll see on the GRE. They'll just ask you to sort of analyze a passage of fiction or nonfiction. The logical reasoning is basically evaluating arguments. So a large part of logical reasoning questions is sort of looking for weaknesses or fallacies in an argument setup and identifying what that weakness will be. And for logic games, most logic games will look like this. They'll provide a brief setup for you and a set of rules, and you'll just need to accurately apply the rules to that setup. So as a very simplified example, it could look something like this. In a canoe, there are 4 seats, and there are 4 people who need to sit in those seats, and 2 of the people can't sit next to each other. How do you seat them? Something like that. Okay, so that's pretty much the LSAT. It is pretty daunting, and I would say you want to set aside about 2 to 3 months to study, and I recommend about 10 to 15 hours a week depending on your study styles and habits. So I started preparing in December for the February one, and I did pretty well on the February test, but especially if you're trying to get into that top tier of law school, so, above the T7, which I was, every percentile point matters. So I decided to take it again, and that's because I had a lot of time in between the February test and the June test to really study. You can only take the LSAT 3 times in 2 years. And law schools are going to see every score that you have on your record. So basically, you don't want to, let's say you take it once and you do pretty well, and you're contemplating about whether you want to take it again, but you know that you'll have no time to effectively study leading up to that second test. There's not really a point in taking it then, because you might end up with a lower score, and when law schools see that, they're going to see that downward trend, which is not going to be helpful to your application. So that's the LSAT. The next step in your law school application process is letters of recommendation. Most schools, at least in my experience, will ask for between 1 to 3 letters, but 2 is the norm. I asked for 2, and because I had just finished my master's at UVA, I had some pretty strong academic resources that I could turn to ask for those letters. One of them was my thesis advisor, obviously, because she and I had a really strong relationship, had worked on a longer piece of writing together, and she knew me outside the classroom, so she could also speak to not only my academic work and my sort of approach to scholarship, but also to some of the values that shaped me as a person. I mean, that's not totally necessary, but it always helps. And my second letter was from another professor in the department who, I had gotten a really good grade in her class, and we had met a couple of times to talk about my thesis as well. And it didn't hurt that she was also pretty famous in her field, so she kind of added that extra oomph. Your letters of recommendation, obviously they should be positive, and that's something that you'll just want to mention when you initially ask for the letter. Just saying like, hey, would you write me a strongly positive letter of recommendation? That seems like letter of rec 101, but you'd be surprised by how many people sort of forget to mention it, and then they end up with a very lukewarm letter from someone who may not know them that well. In general, you'll need at least one academic recommender, and the other one can be, your boss or someone you've worked closely with, but if you can get another academic source, then that would be great as well. Because obviously these letters are speaking to your fitness not only to enter law school, but your ability to sort of last through the academic rigor of your law school and beyond. When it comes to the timeline for your recommendations, you want to take into account, basically what's most convenient for your recommender. So basically I asked according to the academic calendar because both of my recommenders were professors. That meant asking them pretty much early June of 2016 because that's when the school year was just wrapping up. They were finished grading their finals, but they hadn't quite left for the summer yet, and had a little bit of time to sort of think about what they were going to write for me. I mean, just being honest, like this letter is not going to be the highest priority for your recommender, probably. I mean, they have a lot of other work to do. So you want to give them a nice cushion of time that's just enough for them to finish the letter and not feel rushed, but not so long of a period that they will be likely to forget that they promised to write it for you. And obviously, you should not be asking for a letter of recommendation like 2 weeks before it's due. That just is really unprofessional and will probably result in a not so great letter. As far as the process of uploading the recommendations, you'll go on lsac.org through the account that you made when you registered for the LSAT and input the email addresses of your recommenders, and then they'll be prompted to upload the letter directly to the website. There's not really any reason that you should see the letter or that it should pass through your hands. I mean, that is also kind of letter recommendation 101, but it just seems a little bit sus if you've put hands on the letter. And finally, let's talk about the personal statement. Now, the personal statement, some people would say it's not the most important aspect of the law school application, but for me, it really was. For a couple of reasons. I mean, as a writer and someone who came from literary criticism, it was where I felt I could show my strongest, mode of thinking. It's the only place in your application where your personality will be able to shine through, and you'll be able to add something of value beyond what is already on your resume and beyond what is in the numbers that are supposed to represent you. But of course, we know that an LSAT score or a GPA can never fully capture who you are as a scholar, who you are as a person. You obviously want to write multiple drafts, and these should be reviewed by, not only people in your life who are good writers, but also probably by your recommenders. And that's because, if they're professors and they're professors of writing or a related field, they're going to be able to give really good feedback on the actual writing itself. And, even if they're not, it's going to help them sort of sync up the vibe of their letter with the rest of your application. So you don't want a situation where, in your personal statement, you're saying, I've wanted to be a lawyer since before I could walk or whatever. And then your letter of recommendation is like, well, Sally just sort of thought of this on a whim, but I think she'll make a great lawyer. Like, you want the general tone of your application to be coherent and cohesive. You don't want to reiterate your resume. This is really important. You don't want your personal statement to be just a list of things that you've accomplished, as tempting as that might be, because then you'll be wasting this entire component of your application. So the topic of your personal statement is something that you'll want to brainstorm over, a pretty solid period of time. You want to really take your time and be deliberate about what you're choosing. And it should be something that demonstrates your unique mindset, either as a person or as a scholar or whatever. You want to talk about something that really makes you a great contributor to the community, the academic community of whatever law school you're trying to get into. So for me personally, I wrote about the decision-making process to transition from a career in literary criticism to my future career in law. And I did this for a couple of reasons. One, I thought that the admissions committee might actually want to have an explanation for that, because otherwise it could come across as, I'm a person who doesn't know my mind and wants to switch careers at the drop of a hat. The other reason was that, I thought correctly, I think, that it was a pretty unique move and that there weren't a lot of scholars who were making this transition. And so in the pool of applicants, I might stand out as someone who can bring a sort of unique perspective to my future community of scholars. And in talking about that transition, I was also able to demonstrate my approaches to a lot of the related issues on things that I wanted to study, such as race and gender in the structure of law. And finally, once you've submitted all of that, the only thing left will be interviews and decisions. So as far as submissions go, I recommend setting yourself a deadline of around Thanksgiving, because this will give you a little cushion of time in case you're not able to get all the components of your application together. But it'll also sort of head off the need to spend your entire holiday break worrying about it. I submitted my applications in, I think, late September, and I got some decisions back by early October, so it can be pretty quick as a process. So as far as the interviews go, I interviewed with Harvard, UChicago, which was my alma mater, and Columbia. And those interviews were pretty brief, so they give you a 15-minute slot that you'll do over Skype. And they weren't really about rehashing any specific aspects of my application, such as my GPA or my LSAT score, because those are, again, pretty set. These interviews were meant to get a sense of who I am as a person and who I would be if I joined the community, so whether there's a good fit with the vibe of that particular school. They were very short, pretty informal, and quite casual. And then again, your decisions, since it's a rolling basis, those offers of admission are going to come in at different times. So I would recommend just having all of your decisions in place before you make a commitment, just because you never know what might happen. You never know what scholarship package you might be eligible for that might change your way of thinking about a certain school. So that's pretty much it. In terms of the skills you'll need, you've already built them, so don't worry too much about that. And in no part of this process are you required to know that much or anything about law itself. So the LSAT is not a content-based test. It's going to test your critical thinking and reasoning. And in these interviews also, they don't ask you, do you know such and such statute or whatever. It's really, there's no expectation of that. It's something that you're going to law school for. I would say staying on top of your timeline, having a clear plan, and following through on every step of the process is the key to success. So that is pretty much a comprehensive overview of the entire process. Now keep in mind that this was pretty specific to my experience, but I hope that there's some advice that you can apply to your own experience as well. If you have any questions, please feel free to hit the comments up. I'll do my best to respond. Thanks so much, guys.